No, it was silver black. Most of them are.
Yeah, most of them are.
That look like it's getting, or, you know.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Getting that in. We are again, thank you so much for coming tonight. We are in Isaiah again tonight, and we're going to again look at chapter 4. Chapter 4 has 6 verses, but it is really packed with a lot of tremendous thoughts. And every time this week I was studying and came across, I was writing an article, and I was trying to determine how to write a sermon. And I don't write sermons for publication. My manuscripts are designed where I can just read them like I'm going to say it. If I was going to put it out for publication, I would have to go back and edit it and make things a little bit different. And every sermon I preach is designed to be one sermon. Sunday, I preach Sunday morning and Sunday night, and still only got halfway through the original sermon. And a message is exactly what it is. A message is, and they always say is, what is it that you're trying to establish? What is it that you're trying to say? What is the point that you're trying to get across that is faithful to the text? What is it that the chapters, and another thing that and especially expository preaching per se, is what you have to understand, that Isaiah is, no, I don't have an extra. Isaiah, someone says, some people make fun of my pens, and I say to the person, nobody makes fun of your earrings on both ears, and one in your nose, and one in your eyebrow, and one in your jaw, and one in your tongue. And look at all those tattoos, so don't make fun of my
Bunch of pens.
So, but what sometimes is lost in my preaching or teaching is that there's a flow that takes place in the text, and sometimes we forget that we've covered chapter 1, 2, and 3, and that sets the stage for chapter 4. And what happens a lot of times in our study is that we break in where we have left off the previous week. So these are not separate sermons. They are part of the same sermon that Isaiah is trying to teach us. And secondly, there are many applications. Last week's sermon was 7 women take hold of one man. And as I was studying this, trying to determine through research what that means, it is amazing the many different interpretations that people have had over the last several hundred years. And I thought it's interesting that there are different viewpoints, and it all depends on your position as in your doctrine. Preaching every person who interprets Scripture, and we all do that. All of us interpret Scripture. We should know our theology. So many times people say, "Well, I don't want theology. I just want you to preach it." If a preacher doesn't understand theology, he cannot interpret Scripture as he really should. In this vision, so I'm giving you another point. There's a difference between a sermon and an exposition of the verses. I love exposition of the verses. I love to break down the verses. And I love to break down words and what words mean. And I'm best at explaining the verse rather than putting it into a sermon outline or a sermon. I'm better at doing that, but on occasions I do the sermons and take the text and make a sermon out of it rather than explaining the text. But tonight I want to talk about one aspect. Next week I'll try to get to the exposition of the 6 verses. Tonight I want to talk about the branch. In his vision, as we look at chapter 4, notice what it says. And in that day, and when we get to it, we have to understand and interpret in that day. That's what we have to make the interpretation of. In that, so we have to ask our question, in what day? In that day, whenever that day is, 7 women shall take hold of one man. That's in that day. So you got to determine when that day is, when 7 women are going to take hold of that one man. And does that mean literally 7 women are going to take hold of one man? We talked about that last week. Saying, we will eat our own bread, wear our own apparel, only let us be called by thy name to take away our reproach. And last week we talked about that, is that it seems like in a practical application, don't you find that people want to come to church to try to release, try to help them? You know, they're sinful and they've acted sinful, and they're very guilty of their sinfulness, and somehow if they come to church, they think that that's going to help them in the eyes of the public. You've noticed that, you know, drunks will come to church occasionally, adulterers will come to church occasionally, and we want all of them to come to church, but they really don't want to come to church to be saved. They want to come to church to gain some respectability. Yep. And somehow people think coming to church you're going to gain respectability. That doesn't work with God. And you and I have been around long enough to know that doesn't work either. I can spot them a mile, can't you? A person that's always complimentary and always shaking my hands and always being real sweet and real nice, and it's like the rest of the fools that try to fool you in their behavior. But anyway, then that breaks off at verse 1. Then all of a sudden we come to verse 2, and in my Bible it's got the future of Jerusalem. The future of Jerusalem is what is ahead in the next 5 verses. In that day, now here again, in that day. Is in that day the same as in that day in verse 1? That's an interesting thought. In that day, is that the same? And we'll talk about that later on. In that day, the branch of the Lord be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth shall be excellent and comely for them that are escaped of Israel. And it shall come to pass. Now here's another key that you want to look at. It shall come to pass. Isaiah's writing this, and he sits down in the first chapter, he's writing this vision, and he says, and it shall come to pass. Well, it hadn't come to pass yet. He was writing that something in the future should come to pass. Then he that is left in Zion, and he that remaineth in Jerusalem, shall be called holy, even everyone that is written among the living in Jerusalem. So here is what we have to distinguish from that verse. Notice, first of all, it shall come to pass that he that is left in Zion, so we've got to determine who is going to be left in Zion, and he that remaineth in Jerusalem. So there is two places, Zion and Jerusalem. Are they the same place? Are they two different places? He shall be called holy. So those that remain in Zion and those that are left in Jerusalem are going to be called holy. That's interesting, isn't it? Everyone that is written, who are those who will be called holy? And it says, even everyone that is written among the living in Jerusalem. So, we have to determine who are those that have been written among the living in Jerusalem. Now, really, that is a real, isn't it interesting to try to figure that out? But we go back to verse 2, where we'll pick up right now. In that day shall the branch of the Lord be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth shall be excellent and comely for them that are escaped of Israel. So apparently, that's an indication that some of the people in Israel are not going to escape, and there are some that will escape what's taking place. So here again, we have to make some determination as to what this means. In his vision, we're going to take this approach of the idea Jerusalem. They usually come up with where is the most beautiful place in America to live. They list the top 5 cities. Where are the 10 worst cities to live, and they'll give that list. This is the most beautiful city that there will ever be. The holy city. The Hebrew prophet Isaiah in chapter 2 and in chapter 4 describes a glorious future that only the Messiah can achieve.
Right.
You realize this hasn't been achieved yet. You realize their nation has been destroyed.